Dan Doktorow is a former deputy mayor of New York City and a former CEO of Bloomberg. I came to know Dan reasonably well a few years ago when he created Target ALS, which was designed to raise funding to help cure ALS, a disease which killed his father and his uncle. Recently, sadly, Dan was also diagnosed with ALS. I sat down with Dan at Bloomberg recently to talk about his life, philanthropy, and his desire to now do what he can to help cure ALS. Dan, recently, about a year ago, you were diagnosed with ALS, which is a very sad, tragic disease. What was your reaction when you heard about this?
Well, I was actually shocked, despite the fact that my father and uncle died of the disease. And I didn't expect it at all. I really hadn't felt many symptoms, but I went away on a trip to Iceland with my wife, and I had breathing problems, and I couldn't climb rocks. I got exhausted climbing hills, which is really weird because I was in pretty good shape. And so I decided to go see a doctor, not thinking it was ALS. And he noticed my muscles twitching and brought in the head of neurology at the hospital that I went to. And he almost immediately declared I probably had ALS, given my family history. So then I reached out to other doctors who I knew in the ALS field, and they basically confirmed it with a series of tests.
But your father, who died of ALS, and your uncle, who died of ALS, they had a gene which is kind of an ALS gene. You had earlier been tested for that gene years ago, and you were told you didn't have it.
No, I had never been tested. I never wanted to be tested because I didn't want to have to tell my kids if I tested positive. So everyone sort of assumed I had ALS based on my results and my family history. But when the genetic testing came back, I did not have the same genetic mutation that my dad and my uncle, and by the way, their first cousin had. So it's throughout my family, but I didn't have the gene, which has happened like 5 times in history.
So for people who were not familiar with ALS, it first became well known to the public when Lou Gehrig, the famous baseball player, contracted it and died relatively quickly thereafter.
Right.
He was in his 30s, I believe, at the time. Since that time, since the 1930s, have we made that much progress in diagnosing or treating ALS?
So there had been virtually no progress for 140 years from the time it was discovered in 1870. My uncle died in 2010, and in 2010 I decided, look, in my family it's hereditary. My dad had died in 2002. I got to do something. And so I hired a team of scientists to understand why there was so little progress made in the disease. And we came up with a set of theories and created an organization around those theories that included, funding of consortia, funding of core scientific resources that anyone in the world could draw on, bringing in biotech and pharma into the process. And there's been an explosion of progress over the last 10 years. I'm really proud that that organization, Target ALS, has played a major role in catalyzing the progress.
Now, when you were told recently that you have, about a year ago, ALS, you didn't say, I'm now going to just take life very easy. You decided you're going to go raise another $250 million for Target ALS. Why did you say you wanted to put the energy and effort into that, knowing it probably really wouldn't help you?
Because, first of all, this affects my family. Even though I don't have the same genetic mutation that my dad and uncle did, I may have another genetic mutation that has not been discovered yet. My cousins, my brothers, might have ALS. So it's very personal for me. But the other thing is, and most people don't recognize this, 1 in 400 people who are alive today will die of ALS if we don't come up with treatments. And so Target ALS has been amazingly successful over the last 10 years. And I thought there was nothing more important that I could do than to scale up Target ALS and hopefully see real treatments that save people's lives within the next 5 to 10 years. And hopefully we'll be at a point within 10 years that we can see a day when everybody's lives get extended and saved.
A number of years ago, there was a so-called ice bucket challenge, and where I think people were having water dumped on their heads, and it was designed to raise money for ALS. And I think it did raise a fair amount of money, over $100 million. But that was not for research, that was for care of those who already have ALS, is that right?
Some of it went to research, but most of it went to patient care, which is important. I mean, this is a devastating disease. What happens in ALS is the signals that get sent from the brain to the muscles to move die. And when that happens, people get paralyzed. And it's just a progressive disease where you lose more and more control. So patient care is really important. We have to always find the right balance between patient care and research, because at the end of the day, the thing that is going to save the lives of those 1 in 400 people is treatments, and we need a lot of effort to actually come up with effective treatments.
Now, today, we still do not know what causes ALS. Is it a genetic thing completely, or is it environmental, or is it some combination? What do we really know about what causes ALS?
Well, there are certain genetic causes that we know are responsible for ALS. But that's only about 10% of the cases. The other 90%, we don't really know. We know now what the biological pathways are. So we have a much better understanding of the science. And that is leading to potential treatments. But the really understanding the cause, I think we're still got a long way to go.
You know that within 3 to 5 years, it's more likely than not that you will not be alive. So how do you deal with that every day when you get up?
I have been in an amazing mood ever since I've been diagnosed. I stopped thinking about the future.
Talk about a little bit more about ALS in a moment. Let me talk about your background. Where are you from?
I grew up in Birmingham, Michigan, a suburb of Detroit.
Okay, and your father was?
My father was a lawyer who became the chief judge of the Michigan Court of Appeal.
And at what age did he contract ALS?
66 years old. My mother, who was a psychologist, had just died of a rare neck cancer at 64. And literally within weeks of her dying, he started to show symptoms that would later be diagnosed as ALS. He started to limp, basically.
Now you are at what age now?
Today I'm 64.
So about the same age as your father?
A little bit less.
Where'd you go to college?
Harvard.
And what did you study there, and what did you want to be?
I didn't know what I wanted to be. I studied government because I didn't know anything better. But my biggest achievement in college was meeting my wife freshman year. We've now been dating or married 45 years. So that was my biggest achievement in college.
Big achievement. So after college, you went to law school at the University of Chicago?
Before I did that, I was a political pollster for a firm called Market Opinion Research. And I'd be flying all over the country as a 22-year-old, advising candidates. And the fact that they listened to me discouraged me so much that I decided to go to law school.
The fact that they were listening to a 22-year-old made
Correct.
you nervous. Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. So you went to law school at the University of Chicago, and what did you do after you graduated?
I went to work for Lehman Brothers.
So you were an investment banker?
Yep.
And how long did you do that?
3 years.
And then you went into the
Private
higher
equity.
calling of private equity, right?
To the firm that became Oak Hill Partners.
Okay. And so you did that for how many years?
14.
All right, so how did you become close to or get to know Mike Bloomberg?
It's actually a funny story. So back in 1994, I was sitting in the stands of the World Cup semifinal game out at the Meadowlands in New Jersey. It was Italy versus Bulgaria. A friend literally dragged me to the game. I didn't want to go. It was like 100 degrees. We took the bus. It took forever. But I walked into the stadium that day, and I thought it was the most amazing sporting event I had ever seen. Everyone was painted in Bulgarian and Italian colors. You couldn't sit down. So I was standing there through the match, thinking to myself, you could play this game in New York with any two countries in the world, and it would feel exactly the same. And then I started thinking about the Olympics, which I'd always been a fan of, and saying, why has the most international city in the world never hosted the most international event? And I left the stadium that day with this vague notion that New York ought to host the Olympics. And so I built a plan with advisors about how New York could host the Olympics. And eventually I showed it to Mike Bloomberg. When he was running the company, he wasn't contemplating running for mayor. He gave some money, he went on the board. And then when he shockingly won to be mayor, he asked me to join him in City Hall.
And what did you do at City Hall for Mike Bloomberg and the city?
So I was responsible for everything economic and financial. So my title was Deputy Mayor for Economic Development and Rebuilding. First task was rebuilding the World Trade Center site, but then we really rethought the future of New York physically and financially by having a 5-borough economic development strategy.
Now, after serving as Deputy Mayor of New York for development and other projects dealing with economic development, you left after how many years?
I was there for 6 years, and then Mike, one day, Mike Bloomberg, we sat in this bullpen in City Hall. It was an open space, and I sat basically behind him. One day, he wheeled around, and he said, what would you think about going over and running Bloomberg? And I said to him, what are you talking about? In the 6 years that we have sat here together, we have discussed the company for 1 hour total. And he said, no, I think you'd be really good. I'd never run a big company before. I didn't know anything about Bloomberg. When I was in private equity, I was a light user of Bloomberg. I knew one person at the company, and he said, no, I think you'd be really good. So I said, okay, I'll think about it. So I came back the next day, said, okay, I'm gonna do it. But I'm not gonna do it for the same salary I was getting paid in government, which was $1. And I started about 6 weeks later. And after it was announced publicly that I was going to go run Bloomberg, I said to Mike, okay, I'm doing it. What do you want me to do? He said, I don't know. I haven't been there for 6 years. You go figure it out. And I did.
So how many years did you run Bloomberg?
7.
7 years. And the company grew pretty nicely during that period of time?
Yeah, I mean, as soon as I got there, the financial crisis happened. But we grew from, I think, 5.4 billion in revenues to 9 in the 7 years that I was there.
After Mike finished his 3rd term as mayor, he came back and resumed the position of being CEO. You left the company and you started another company called Sidewalk Labs. What was that?
That was a company I formed with Larry Page, and Google became Alphabet, that was focused on urban innovation. And what we wanted to do was build the most innovative place in the world, but also by focusing on building a place, develop ideas, urban innovation ideas that could dramatically transform the cities.
So you're running that company, and then when you got the news that you had ALS, you decided, I'm out of this, I'm going to go devote myself to target ALS, is that right?
Basically, and I'm on the board of a couple of the companies that we created, but yeah, my focus was definitely on ALS. And I also wanted to spend much more time with my family, with friends, travel, do things that I'd always wanted to do. And it's actually worked out amazingly well.
How do you think New York City is doing today? Mike Bloomberg is no longer mayor. There's been a mayor after him, and now we have a new mayor, Eric Adams, in New York. You think New York is as safe as it was when you were in the government?
It's not as safe as it was. Crime is clearly rising. I mean, it's not back to the dark old days of, pre-Giuliani in the early 90s. But we got to be careful because safety is the foundation of everything. And so I know the current mayor is committed to reducing crime, but we're gonna have to be incredibly aggressive in making sure that crime does not increase.
Are you involved any longer in New York City matters, or you're advising New York City?
Yeah, the mayor and governor actually asked me to co-chair a panel or a task force on reviving the commercial districts throughout the city. So I've been in the middle of that. That later this fall we'll produce the report that hopefully, will be pretty inspiring here and in other places.
One of the other projects you conceived of is the Shed, and you were for a while the chairman of it for a long time. You got it off the ground. What is the Shed?
We wanted to put a cultural institution on the far west side of Manhattan, and so what we decided to do was create a new kind of a cultural institution that would be remarkably adaptable. The spaces could be adapted to anything. They could accommodate virtually all forms of artistic expression. There's many different venues in it. The building literally moves back and forth. It is so flexible. It's sort of an architectural marvel. And I'm really proud of it.
Now, perhaps the most famous person who had ALS was Lou Gehrig.
Right.
And of course, some people still call it Lou Gehrig's disease. But another famous person who had it was Stephen Hawking. And he lived for some 30 plus years with it. How do you explain that sometimes people can live for 30 years plus?
A couple percent of people live beyond 10 years. One of the decisions that I'm going to face, because my major symptom is respiratory, and that's why people ultimately die, is to get a tracheostomy, which means that you can't breathe independently. You also can't eat, and you also generally cannot talk. So you communicate by looking and spelling out words on a computer screen. And a lot of people don't want to live that way. I think I probably would. I want to see my grandchildren grow up. I still think I could be engaged in things. Again, that's sort of my optimistic nature, that it's not just about believing there's a cure, but it's sometimes about believing that the better of two bad alternatives is something worth doing. So, if faced with that choice, I think that's what I would do. And, I'll need a lot of help, but fortunately I can afford it.
Now, the word progressive is a word used for ALS and other diseases as well. Progressive is a euphemism for it's never going to get better, it's going to get worse. So progressive in the case of ALS means you're going to die much sooner than you would otherwise die.
Absent some sort of miracle progress, which I don't really expect. For 80% of ALS patients die within 3 to 5 years.
Many people, when they face death and the certainty of death, and everybody's going to die at some point, but people generally think it's way down the road or over the horizon. You know that within 3 to 5 years, it's more likely than not that you will not be alive. So how do you deal with that every day when you get up?
You know, the interesting thing is, I have been in an amazing mood ever since I've been diagnosed. I've had maybe 1 down hour cumulatively in the last year. And I've got many theories to try and explain it. The biggest one is when I was diagnosed, I stopped thinking about the future. It was not something I tried to do. I think it was sort of my optimistic nature protecting me. And it's not like I'm in denial. I know the statistics. I spend lots of time with ALS patients. I've lived with it with my father, my uncle. My college roommate died of ALS. So I know what's going to happen. But I stopped thinking about the future. And that has been just an enormous benefit for me. I have a lot of other theories to explain why I've been so unfazed by the disease, why I've been so happy. That includes, I've had a great life. I have a wonderful family. I've got great friends. I've done what I wanted career-wise. I've done outside things like the shed or the Olympics that I wanted to do because I was passionate about them. I've had a great life, and obviously I want it to continue, but if it doesn't, I'm grateful for the life that I've had. And then, you know, I've been bathed in sort of like the love and support of so many people. When I announced that I had ALS, I got thousands of notes. You know, lots of people talking about the impact that I'd had on their life, etc. I literally felt like I died and witnessed my own funeral. But then the last part of it is, I feel like I've got purpose. With Target ALS, I feel like I can contribute to saving people's lives. You know, maybe my own, unlikely, my kids, my family, but those 1 in 400 people, and there's nothing more important than that. So I feel like I'm on my last mission, and it gives me a real sense of purpose.